Why is it that we all presume so strongly that we know something? There is a culture that's permeated where almost all of us think that we understand the world. And we all think that if we do certain things in a certain way, that we will get to where we want to go to, or that we will achieve the things that we want to achieve. And as an educator, it's fascinating to me both on the presumption. There's two sides of this that ends up happening, and I'll sort of suggest something that's interesting here towards the end. That the two sides is that as an educator, as a professor that studies the world, I like to think of myself more as a scientist, not even a social scientist. I like to think of myself as I'm studying the world, and if there's something that's curious, I'm going to pursue that thing. But there's this presumption that by studying it, that we know more about it, and that we understand it, and that we can talk about it. But as I've studied the world, I've realized I really don't know that much. And I realize that the basis of our knowledge is often very weak. It's often based on very dubious assumptions. And even the strongest of evidence that we actually have, if you start picking it apart, it often really doesn't hold up. So that's on one side of it, right? So there's this expectation that we understand the world. But on the other side is that it makes it very difficult to accumulate any particular knowledge or dispel knowledge and to teach about this sort of uncertainty or doubt that often exists, right? So in that case, then you get a whole bunch of students, people that are absorbing this knowledge, thinking that they're just as better off or they're just as good. And why should I learn from somebody that is uncertain and doubtful and doesn't really understand the world? Right? My view is just as strong. And it's very difficult because that there are a lot of people that have this particular perspective. I often say that it's really the presumption in education is that people want to learn. But if you actually interact with the real world, you realize that that is not true. That's a rare, weird person that actually wants to learn. Most people don't want to. They have a very strong view of this world. In fact, you may even go back to, if you start thinking about teachers, um, primary school teachers, it's probably at about third grade that there's a group of people that just learn to dissociate, that they don't want to learn, that maybe the world is unsafe, so they can't trust it. Um, and it becomes very, very difficult to connect with them, right? And sort of move this. And teachers have to go through all sorts of hoops just to connect, to get people to actually want to learn, right? All sorts of different tricks and things like that. Now, on the other side of it, right? So we have these two dueling sides of that a lot of people, first of all, I as a researcher, I don't understand the world. I really am very naive about the complexity of the world, and all of the tools that we have presume that things are very simple and that the world is not necessarily that complicated. And then on the other side, we've got all of these people that have sort of thrown up their hands and say, why should I learn from somebody? I just learn from myself. That's the best thing for me to do. And the reason why this is somewhat of an interesting tension is that I think that there are some general rules that, yeah, I think enough people agree upon actually do work. And it's not whether that they actually do work in the real sense of things, right? In the sense that they actually are predictive, but it's the fact that everybody believes that they work. And so you're learning this kind of language of how the world actually works. Right? There's a classic example of this in finance, which is the CAPM model, or the Black-Scholes model, which is another one. These are just mathematical models. But much of the finance world actually believes in it, so the markets behave in that way. And as a consequence, if you're not investing in that way, you're likely not going to do really well in the market. You have to understand it to do well in the market. Um, so it adds this layer of complexity. Now, why is this the case? I don't think we've always presumed. I think, maybe there's some human nature that's there, but I don't think it's always been the case. I think a lot of this has to do with this enlightenment that we've been going through for the last few hundred years, and perhaps longer than that, right? Like there's good reason to doubt that the Enlightenment didn't happen in the Renaissance and it was sort of ongoing, but we just didn't have a track record of this. Um, but if you think about the Enlightenment was this period where, um, essentially there was books that were printed, the Bible, and people started to have to learn about what's going on. And then when you learn about what's going on, because you actually start reading in of yourself, you start disbelieving what was told before. And as a consequence of that, as we sort of go through more and more layers of this sort of unraveling of the Enlightenment, where more and more people are getting knowledgeable, knowledge becomes the key thing that you're competing on, and it's no longer other things, right? It becomes how knowledgeable that you actually are that you compete on. And so you have to do displays of knowledge, however that might be, to demonstrate that you are somehow competitive or worthy, or in the grand scheme of things, that not only that you're capable of making money, but you're also capable of being a good mate because you do that. Um, and of course, then you could sort of, have evolutionary factors for doing that. But when you start looking, and that's where I think, it's probably much, much older than the simple Enlightenment, but there was, in general, there was a very, very much a change in culture at that moment, that we know of, right? That is observable. And with that, um, becomes all of these interesting things where we have to compete and say we're knowledgeable in various different areas, or skilled in various different areas. Um, and because of that, you know, it becomes difficult to separate, real knowledge and really what we're really trying to think and what we're trying to do from the displays of knowledge and what we want to show to other people and demonstrate to other people, which is complicated. These two things may or may not overlap. Um, we know that, as people that look at this, there's lots of conversation about how these things don't overlap, and it makes it very difficult to communicate and to be honest about the natural world because of this. So, another layer, and there's going to be, relatively no point to this. This is just something that is just interesting, I think. But another layer of this is that we're moving towards an economy where this capability or the competition of knowledge is being eroded. And it's being eroded rather rapidly by skill sets, by machines and tools that are going to do it better than us. So, what is the end result of this? That I don't know. I think that there are things that make us uneasy with this, um, but at the same time, I think that there are some really interesting possibilities that will emerge from it, but we just don't know. So I think on both sides of this tension, right? I think it's going to change a lot, um, and I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what to do, but it's an interesting tension always, where you start looking at who wants to learn, and then when you go and look at the natural world, you realize that you really can't learn that much. Um, I don't know, right? Like, that's my big answer with all of this is I don't know what's happening. But I know that having a language and to describe this is helpful. I know that being able to think about things and describe them is helpful. I don't know if there's any what's called predictive validity from understanding of any of these things anymore. But that's all I have to say. I know it's a little bit of a sort of a moment where I don't really say anything at the end, but I think that that is actually the point, is we don't need to know the world, and yet there's always something to be understood about the world. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.